Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about interesting and noteworthy Ukrainians from around the globe. Today is Tuesday, August 13th, 2024. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest for this episode is Yuri Yanchyshyn, who is a Fulbright scholar and period furniture and wooden artifacts conservator. Welcome, Yuri. How are you?
Good. Pleasure to meet you, Michael.
Thank you so much for joining us today. To start off with, can we get a bit about your educational and professional background?
I graduated from the University of Michigan and the California Institute of the Arts, where I earned a master's degree in fine arts. I also completed additional conservation training at the Amsterdam Academy for Restoration and the Smithsonian program here in the United States. Over 30 years ago, in the late 80s, I was a consulting conservator at the Metropolitan Museum. Since then, I've been in private practice leading two conservation firms in the New York metropolitan area, Period Furniture Conservation and Kensington Preservation. In 2017, I was awarded 2 Fulbrights to Ukraine as a specialist and as a scholar, teaching at the Lviv Polytechnic National University in Western Ukraine on the preservation of Ukraine's wooden cultural heritage, including its wooden churches, or tsarkvas in Ukrainian, its iconostases, icons, furniture, and gilded frames. Since the war began, I've been involved in numerous activities and initiatives to preserve that heritage.
Yuri, can you describe your Ukrainian American roots?
I grew up in the Ukrainian community in Detroit in the 1950s and 1960s, the child of Ukrainian parents who had been displaced by World War II. My father was an accomplished veterinarian who ran his own animal clinic, and my mother was a housewife who enjoyed painting ceramics in various Ukrainian styles. During that time, Detroit had a very active and vibrant Ukrainian community. For example, I attended Ukrainian elementary and high schools and a Ukrainian Saturday school and participated in broader community life. That included the Plast Boy Scouts and music lessons from the Ukrainian Music Institute. Amidst all of that, in retrospect, 2 unrecognized events at the time profoundly impacted me, setting the stage for my later life. One was the transformation over many years of the interior of the Greek Catholic Church that we belonged to, the Church of the Immaculate Conception, with the painting of religious murals on the wall and the cupola, and the building and installation of an iconostases, including the icons that were a part of it. Previously, the church had plain walls and an open altar, as found in many Christian churches. The artist who executed all of that was Mikhailo Dmitrenko, an outstanding painter from eastern Ukraine who had also emigrated to the West after the war. Seeing the progress of the murals being painted every Sunday service, month after month, year after year, left an impression. Today, I consider the Church of the Immaculate Conception one of the great pearls of Ukrainian diaspora art. A second event was my attending services as a teenager one summer at St. John the Baptist, the wooden tsarkva in Hunter, New York. It is an experience I remember to this day. The woodwork of a master carver, Mikhailo Chereshnovsky, another émigré master. I felt then, as I do today, that the work was breathtaking. These 2 experiences were to lay the foundation for my activities much later in my life when I became involved in conservation and historic preservation in Ukraine.
So let's get down to basics. What exactly is a conservator, and what is the field of conservation?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Conservation today is a unique, highly technical field marrying the disciplines of science and art. Conservators address the material substance of art objects, their history, and how best to preserve them. The goal is to enable these objects to convey their meanings and stories clearly and honestly for many generations to come. My day-to-day activities as a conservator include examination, documentation, treatment, and preventive care of works of art, supported by research and education.
So, why did you decide to become a period furniture and wooden artifacts conservator?
Upon completion of my fine arts studies, I began to be drawn to woodworking rather than pursuing a career as an artist. It was an outgrowth of my childhood interest in building model wooden ships, which gave me tremendous pleasure and satisfaction. Over time, I extended my woodworking skills, becoming a licensed California contractor focusing on remodeling, a builder of custom circular staircases, a cabinet maker, and a furniture builder. Later, I began to repair broken furniture, and then I became a furniture restorer, and finally, a consulting conservator at the Metropolitan Museum in the late 80s. That progression, during numerous years at the Met, including much additional study, such as the study of chemistry, microscopic wood identification, or the knowledge of coatings on furniture and art objects, studying both here and abroad.
Who have been a few of your major clients? And please talk about one or two of your past projects.
My clients are the major cultural institutions and private collectors in the United States and abroad. My treated objects are in numerous museum collections besides the Metropolitan Museum, including the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Getty, the Field Museum in Chicago, the Nelson Atkins Museum, the Morgan Library, and many smaller museums and private collections. I also provide a unique service, the argon and oxic fumigation of art objects. Over time, many art objects, including wooden artifacts, become susceptible to insect attack. This technique neutralizes the insects and prevents further damage while not harming the art object or the environment. One project I completed over 30 years ago for the Metropolitan Museum is still exciting today and is on permanent display in the German-Austrian galleries at the museum. The project entailed conserving German Rococo furniture from the Seehof Castle in Bavaria. This ornately carved and gilded furniture suite had been on display for many years, with the backs of the furniture upholstered in beautiful Chinese silk. However, upon a visit to Germany, the then curator of the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department at the Met noticed numerous similar furniture with extensively carved and gilded backs. Upon her return, the Met's furniture was x-rayed, which revealed beautiful, intricate carving of leaves coming through a wooden lattice, as if in a garden room. However, many of the leaves had been chiseled away by the upholsterer at some point in the past to tack down the upholstery, and the upholstery had hidden the damage. At that point, my 2-year project at the Met began. I became a team member, carving and gilding the missing leaves and treating numerous other objects in the museum collection, such as gilded wooden sculptures and frames. That museum exposure to art conservation changed my life and spurred me to further my education in later years with additional study. A second project occurred much later in my career. It was writing the treatment specifications for the conservation of the brick house, interior furniture and objects as part of the glass house of the Philip Johnson Glasshouse Estate in New Canaan, Connecticut, a National Historic Landmark. Philip Johnson is considered one of America's great architects, and these buildings and interiors are modernist icons. During his lifetime, however, they had fallen into neglect. When he died, the National Trust for Historic Preservation took over the care of the buildings to preserve them for future generations. This project was interesting since it involved working with contemporary materials. Based on my proposal, the treatment of the brick house has recently been completed and is open today for viewing. It's worth a visit. It was an honor to have been awarded this project.
Yuri, how did you become involved with the preservation of wooden churches or cerkvas in Ukraine? And please talk about your Fulbright specialist status that was awarded to you in 2016 for Ukraine and what activities were part of this program.
That's a great question. Since although I had grown up in the Ukrainian community here in the United States, I had actually never visited Ukraine. However, when events in Ukraine were making daily news, such as the Maidan in 2014 and afterwards, I contacted Myron Stachyu, former head of the Fulbright program in Ukraine, to inquire if my skills could be useful. These conversations led to my reaching out to Mykola Bevs, head of the Department of Architecture and Conservation at the Lviv Polytechnic National University. Not long afterwards, I was awarded Fulbright Specialist status and a year later, Fulbright Scholar status. My activities in Ukraine were teaching a series of introductory lectures on the conservation of wooden artifacts in Ukrainian, based on a Western body of knowledge, and advising on the historic preservation of Ukraine's wooden tsarkvas. I also addressed the Ukrainian parliament, advocating for increased funding for historic preservation. One interesting anecdote from that period was that I performed the authentication of the wooden balcony in the masonry church of St. Ilyi in Subotiu. It was Khmelnytsky's church. It was the only authentic work of wood left in the masonry church, which had been the subject of a watercolor by Ukraine's bard Taras Shevchenko, and memorable poetry with lines that begin with Stoyit Seli Subotovi na Hori Vysoki.
What have been some of the major challenges in your efforts to preserve wooden tsarkvas in Ukraine, and how have these efforts been funded?
The preservation of Ukraine's wooden tsarkvas is challenging due to the natural agents of degradation that affect them, as they affect all wooden buildings and architecture, such as water seepage, wood rot, insect damage, and fire, just to name a few. Over the centuries, local parishes and their artisans address these issues, sometimes competently, sometimes not. Today, historic preservation is taught at universities, and the architects have taken the lead on preserving Ukraine's cultural heritage. Before the war, the government modestly funded restoration efforts, which unfortunately, preservation architects did not always oversee. That led to undesirable results. This situation and the lack of access to Western knowledge and expertise due to the language barrier were some of the reasons for my teaching in Ukraine.
What particular difficulties has the Russian invasion of Ukraine posed for the conservation of Ukraine's wooden artifacts?
Another powerful agent of degradation that I have not mentioned previously is human activity, which sometimes manifests itself in the purposeful destruction of culture. This situation was very much the case with the destruction of Ukraine's wooden tsarkvas, iconostases, icons, and other cultural artifacts during the 1920s and 1930s. Today, we are witnessing once again the purposeful destruction of Ukraine's cultural heritage on an immense scale. And the reason for that is simple. Culture is identity. And by destroying or stealing its culture, you destroy a nation's identity. Therefore, preserving Ukraine's cultural heritage today has taken on an existential character. Ukrainian museums were unprepared for the war. As the Russian army was making its way into Ukraine, museums are scrambling to pack up their collections and move them to safer locations. In addition, many museum collections and archives were not digitized or fully photographed, with registrars' records of the collections being in the form of ledger books. Thankfully, today, this digitization process is underway as we speak. This lack of documentation extended to Ukraine's wooden churches as well, their tsarkvas. To correct that situation, one of my many initiatives was the digital architectural scanning of the remaining Kozatsky tsarkvy of eastern Ukraine, very close to the war zone and little known in the West. A Leica digital architectural scanner was purchased with donations, and the faculty of Lviv Polytechnic National University traveled to eastern Ukraine last autumn to execute the scans. This was done so that should these structures be damaged or destroyed, they could be rebuilt. Another initiative is concerned with education. There will be a tremendous amount of work to be done once hostilities cease, so educating a new generation of conservators has generated numerous initiatives on my part, from my 2-year effort to translate a 300-page Getty conservation text into Ukrainian, mentioned earlier, to providing distance learning lectures on very unique conservation topics, such as microscopic wood identification, to encouraging young Ukrainian conservators to form their own NGO and become a part of the world conservation community.
Yuri, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I do want to ask you one final question. Please describe any new projects on which you will be working in the near future.
All of the efforts that I've described require funding, and I'm grateful to the many individuals, nonprofits, and foundations that have supported my work, especially the Red Arch Cultural Heritage Law and Policy Research, a nonprofit that preserves cultural heritage in war zones, as well as the Temerty Foundation. The digital scanning initiatives of Ukraine's Kozatsky Tserkvi is ongoing and deserves further support. Please visit Red Arch's website for a detailed description of the Tserkvas under Ukraine Initiative section. However, another initiative of mine, also on that same webpage, has recently received attention and support. It is to create a regional art conservation laboratory at the National Museum of Andrei Sheptytsky in Lviv. This museum has a collection of over 4,500 Ukrainian icons, the largest in Ukraine. These icons, one of the bedrocks of Ukrainian experience, are not technically researched or dated. This crucial information about Ukraine's identity is lacking. Ukrainian culture is a part of world culture and is recognized as such, with 8 Ukrainian wooden tserkvas being recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And yet, its much larger collection of icons is little known. Funding this research capability will contribute to answering the question of Ukrainian identity. Хто я? Звідки я походжу?
Yuri, where can our audience go online to find out more about your work?
They can visit the website of the Red Arch Cultural Heritage Policy Law and Research, which I mentioned previously, or they can visit periodfurnitureconservation.com. There you will find many, many initiatives on my part to preserve Ukraine's cultural heritage.
Yuri, I want to thank you so much for coming on Krynytsia today.
Michael, thank you for inviting me to your program.
I have been speaking with Yuri Yanchyshyn, who is a Fulbright scholar and period furniture and wooden artifacts conservator, and has done much work for the preservation of Ukrainian tserkvas. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. I'm the producer and host of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.